I hope you don't think it inappropriate, but I just thought today, in the worrying times that we've entered, that when I give an extra warm welcome to people who are joining us, and we've got people worldwide, the UK, from America, from China, that in doing so, that we just for a moment remembering the people who are caught directly in the crisis today. So I know it doesn't help them, but it seems wrong not to think at this moment how perhaps blessed we are to be together, and it feels very strong to be together. And I don't think ever in my lifetime that Wordsworth's remind that we have all of us one human heart seems more appropriate or more important. So a very warm welcome. A very warm welcome. Disparate Romantics continues in its new season. Welcome to regulars, especially welcome to new people. And it's very nice. I noticed tonight we've got some Blue Badge Guide people joining us, and so very nice to see you. As I said, thank you always to Hannah, because as I said, without Hannah, we simply wouldn't be together. We focus on Dorothy. It's part of our series of events marking her 250th birthday year. And tonight, the particular discussion will be on relationships. Relationships with family, particularly William, particularly with her female, Jane Pollard. My shoulder is a portrait of Lady Beaumont. I'm stood in the exhibition room. The lighting is dim because of the preservation of the manuscripts. It's also got an LED lighting, so it might be flickering. So apologies for that, but I hope you understand. The relationships are explored in the exhibition, as I said, that's where I am now, and that we hope, technology willing, that we'll be able to focus on one or two of the manuscripts in the show. And you probably know, if you've been following our marketing and social media, that we've got something very special in the exhibition, something that's never been seen in Grasmere before. And in the second half of our evening, we will be focusing on that. And I really look forward to Lucy talking us through the manuscripts of this particular moment. So introducing our guests, one, an established scholar of international standing, the other, an early career academic, make an impression. And as I say, certainly made an impression in this exhibition. And so they're going to be in conversation. And they've had some great conversations already. Hannah and I have been privileged to it. And so I know they gain a lot from each other. So it's an honor to welcome, and a personal pleasure to welcome Professor Lucy Newlyn. Lucy's a long-standing friend of the Trust, a poet, Emeritus Fellow of English at St Edmund Hall, Oxford. In addition to studies of the Romantic poets, she is herself a poet. She's published 5 collections: Ginnell, Earth's Almanac, Vital Stream, The Marriage Hearse, and The Craft of Poetry. And her book, William and Dorothy, Words with All in Each Other, was obviously very pertinent and relevant to tonight. She lives near Truro. She was telling me Storm Eunice hasn't been particularly gentle on her part of the world, but a very warm welcome, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's lovely to see you as always, and I'm so excited to be here to talk to Samantha, who's got some amazing ideas.
She does indeed. So a welcome to a newish friend, Samantha Frank. Samantha's a writer and reader from Illinois, USA. We first met a few years ago when Samantha came on a study abroad with a college, Principia College, and I think your professor at the time, Heidi Snow, is also joining us this evening. It was a day that she helped organize on romanticism and ecology, and I think we had Tim Morton that day, didn't we, Samantha? That was the day to remember. She's a recent collaborator in the exhibition, and she's currently working on a paper about Dorothy Wordsworth, friendship, and aromantic asexuality. So a very warm welcome to you, Samantha.
Thank you, Jeff. It's really wonderful to be here with both of you, and yeah, I miss being in Grasmere. I wish I could be on site.
It would be nice to see you again. So Samantha and Lucy will be in conversation. We plan to have a break, as we say, close by 9, And as always, as Hannah said, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, please share them as we go. So to begin with, I'd just like to invite Lucy and Samantha to say something of their work that relates to conversation. Lucy, your book, Alone in Each Other, is a wonderfully...
All in each other, all in each other.
That's what I meant. That's what I've got written down. I'm not sure what I said.
Important.
Sorry, I just misread it. All in Each Other is a wonderfully empathetic and insightful account of the relationship of William, Dorothy and Coleridge, and in the context of thinking of the time, recognizing the significance of the siblings' separation as children and their unique closeness that followed their relationship, their shared love of nature. And some of the themes are explored in your poems, Vital Stream, which respond to the events in the year 1802, one of which, of course, was the wedding, and in particular, Dorothy's journal entry for that occasion. And I wonder if, introducing your work, Lucy, we can invite you to read one of the sonnets and maybe comment on it.
I'll do that. Thank you very much for those very generous words, Jeff. Well, I should probably first mention the first book that I wrote on Wordsworth and Coleridge, which was a study of dialogue, the intertextual dialogue between those two great poets. I was very interested in friendship and in the dynamics of friendship, and particularly in the way that conversations were carried out through references to each other's poems. I wrote that book, wasn't satisfied with it because I'd missed out Dorothy. So, I mean, she was there, but only as a kind of shadowy presence. So I wanted to go on later to triangulate and to correct the kind of false impression that I'd given in that book, because she was such a crucial component of the creative process in William's and Coleridge's life. And then, having done that, I wasn't satisfied with that either, because there are things that there are questions that rise out of writing a big book on a big subject like that, which leave you wanting to do further research. And this time, I wanted to do it through the medium of poetry, which allows one to be more speculative. You can do things in poems that you are simply not allowed to do as a literary biographer or a scholar. I wanted to ask questions, I wanted to speculate. So Vital Stream, which is a collection of, I'll hold it up for you, a collection of 135 sonnets, can you imagine? About 6 months in 1802 came out of that, and it was 1802 that concerned me. It's always been the most fascinating period for me because of the centrality of Dorothy. So what I did, why did I choose sonnets? Because in 1802, Dorothy read Milton's sonnets to William, and he got inspired and he wrote some of his greatest work out of that reading. Also, sonnets are associated with love, and I wanted to explore the possible romantic, and I must emphasize, not sexual, this is very important to me, that it wasn't sexual, relationship between William and Dorothy, which I hadn't given enough space to in my book. So I want to start with a sequence of poems this was the starting point for the book, a sequence of poems, and I'm only going to read one of them, but I wrote 5, which are about the extraordinary moment on the morning of William's marriage to Mary Hutchinson, old family friend, on which Dorothy describes, well, I'll read it to you. This is the morning this is the morning when William is getting married. William had parted from me upstairs. I gave him the ring with how deep a blessing. I took it from my forefinger, where I had worn it all the night before. He slipped it again onto my finger and blessed me fervently. I'm slipping on a bit. I kept myself as quiet as I could, but when I saw the two men running up the walk, coming to tell me it was over, I could stand it no longer and threw myself on the bed, where I lay in stillness, neither hearing nor seeing anything, till Sarah came upstairs to meet me and said, "They are coming." And I will simply read you the poem, the first of the poems that I wrote in response to that extraordinary journal entry. "Flesh of my flesh," he'd said, "bone of my bone." And so she'd worn it like a talisman, never to part, never to lose her home, not even when the next new phase began. Now, even now, it passes to and fro between dear sister and much dearer brother. See how she wills herself to let it go. See how it reclaims her as his lover. With all my worldly goods I thee endow, so the ring pledges as it's lightly passed from hand to hand, both then and now, as if still undecided to the last. You'd almost think it had life of its own, flesh of her flesh indeed, bone of her bone. And I'll hand back to you there, Jeff, because that's...
Well, as you were reading it out, some people might have been able to follow the words a little bit on the screen. What I've shown is the facsimile. It's not the real thing, of course, but that sense of that crossing out and then
yeah, which forms the centerpiece for another poem later. The question of why she so heavily scored out those lines. Was it because after the marriage, the journal, which up till then had been private property, as it were, for her and William, would become a household object which could be seen by Mary too? Did she feel that Mary would feel this was too sensitive and too worrying a thing to have talked about? I think that is what Pamela Woof suggests in her notes to the Grasmere Journal. But I mean, it leaves us, we still don't know, do we? We don't have any real answer to that.
If people don't know your book, Lucy, I recommend that they do, because it does do exactly as you say. It does explore ideas, and they're beautiful poems, and it's an opportunity, I think, also to thank you for the proceeds that you were very generous with. So, do that. Samantha, if I may, your perspective will, I think, be new to many people, especially if they haven't seen the show, if they haven't seen the pamphlet that you've created. I and many people really I love the project that you did with Hannah, and you brought a group together and you explored the themes and you made the link with the past and with the present. So I wonder if I could invite you to introduce your work in your own words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jeff. So one of the focuses of my undergraduate research and creative work was on aromanticism and asexuality. And for those who are unfamiliar with those terms, Jeff also mentioned them earlier. Hannah will be putting them in the chat, the definitions. But essentially, aromantic refers to someone who doesn't experience romantic attraction, and asexual refers to someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction. And the folks in these communities often use shorthand to refer to these terms. So aro is short for aromantic and ace is short for asexual. And that's probably how I'll be referring to that throughout our conversation today. But from my experience, this has looked a lot just like centering friendships and centering familial relationships. And I first was introduced to Dorothy about 3 years ago now, which feels like longer than it should. And I think learning about that she had never married and learning about her really close friendships that lasted like over the course of her life, and learning about her close familial relationships as well, just really struck a chord with me deeply. And I was really interested in exploring this connection further that I felt with her. So I decided that I wanted to, from my university background and my own personal perspective, I wanted to kind of read her writing from an Aroace perspective. And so initially this took shape as a kind of personal reflective essay looking at the importance that Dorothy put on her friendships and how I related from my personal experience. But then as I read more of her letters to friends, I picked up on ideas in her writing that felt very reminiscent of a lot of ideas that are shared in Aroace communities and in Aroace scholarship. And from that exploration, I sort of developed an approach to being able to read her writing this way. And this line of inquiry led very gratefully to the theme in the current exhibition in the room that Jeff is in now, of Dorothy and friendship. And one thing that was really special about this exhibition is that each of the contributors collaborated with various community groups to really explore the topics that they were interested in discussion and also creatively. So I worked with Hannah, as Jeff said, who's helping us tonight, and we were able to put together a group of Aroace individuals from kind of like local to where I was, and then local to Cumbria in the UK. And we met with these individuals over Zoom over a few months, having lots of conversations about Dorothy, about her writing, from looking at different passages, particularly her letters to her close female friends, and kind of reading it, thinking about it from our own perspectives. And then together, out of these reflections and conversations, we designed a display that's in the gallery. And then we also worked on this like creative pamphlet that really put like our experiences in conversation with Dorothy's writings. And I think it felt like a very meaningful, I mean, it was very meaningful for me personally, but I think group members found it really meaningful, and different people who have been able to read it and look at it. I think it's sparking some interesting conversations. So yeah,
it's a tremendous contribution. Many congratulations. It's fresh, it's engaging, and above all, it's contemporary, which makes it very accessible. I hugely enjoyed it. And I think you have introduced a completely new way of thinking about Dorothy. And I just want to kind of pursue that a little bit further with you. De Selincourt described Dorothy as having a genius for friendship. So what I want to know really is, what do you think that consisted in? And you've got a lovely letter in the pamphlet where you personally are writing to Dorothy, and I found it very touching. And I just wonder whether you could read that to us, because I think it highlights Dorothy's ability to make friends with us now as 21st century readers. So can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you. The letter that Lucy's referring to is in here in the zine, and next to it is a kind of diagram of how one could fold a letter in the same way that Dorothy did. I'll read it and then maybe speak about what you're asking about the genius question. Dear Dorothy, I too love writing letters to my friends. For me, there's an intimacy in accepting any imperfections and producing a tangible thing. I feel connected by the process. I find a moment, engage with the paper, and guide the ink into letters, into words, into complete thoughts. I fold my message, creasing it into 3 dimensions. Then I put it in the mail to be collected by the post person. It changes hands, I don't know how many times, before it is deposited with a particular friend, however far away. The movement of this process is expansive, transforming the intimate crafting of the letter into a broad-reaching spectacle. You wrote to Lady Beaumont, who Jeff pointed out is behind the portrait behind her, and who was first introduced to Dorothy through Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And their friendship actually started out over letter correspondence and developed that way before they were able to meet. You wrote to Lady Beaumont once that writing her brought her nearer to you and you to her. Reading your letters has made me feel similarly about you. I wanted to write you a letter in return. Friendships are my dearest relationships, and I don't take them lightly. I think we are similar in this respect. Your genius for friendship is still having an impact over 200 years later. I've learned a lot from you, your friend, Samantha.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So good. So I really cherish that. Do you think, I mean, that comes out of your experience of reading a lot of letters by Dorothy. So could you then, just to kind of balance that out, could you talk to us about one of the letters which sparked your research and your thoughts about it?
Yes, definitely. So there's this one letter, which I think Jeff has in the gallery space, that Dorothy wrote to Jane Pollard, her childhood best friend, or they became best friends in childhood, in 1793. So she's about 21 at that point. She's living with her aunt and uncle in Norfolk, which is like way far away in England from Halifax, where she grew up. She and Jane grew up. And I was very intrigued by this letter. Not only is it long, and you can see just how big it is, Jeff's showing you, but also she explains to Jane in the letter that she wrote it over 20 different sittings and standings. So very much like you can see the care, and I think it's also a really good example of a lot of the ways in which Dorothy seems to build intimacy in her friendships, and what ways that I found patterns of from reading her different letters. And I feel like this one is a good example of that. For example, affection and her articulating her affection for her friends to them, and her tendency to keep friends close in thought and to let them know she was thinking of them. And Dorothy at times draws the recipient into the physical act of writing the letter, something which I also tried to do in my letter to her, and that felt appropriate. But for example, in this letter, she writes, I would have you consider, she reflects on the state of her handwriting in the letter by the end of it. And she writes, I would have you consider this very bad writing as proof of my affection for you. I would not have sent such a scrawl to anyone but you or my brother William. And then I think, Jeff, if we could move to the close-up of the first passage. There are also moments in her letters when Dorothy intentionally addresses her friendship with that friend, whether that's advocating for more frequent correspondence or sharing her feelings or imagining future moments together. And I think this passage towards the front of the letter very much illustrates this. And so I wanted to read it. I actually I have a friend's, my mentor's De Selincourt copy. The evening is a lovely one, and I have strolled into a neighboring meadow where I am enjoying the melody of birds and the busy sounds of a fine summer's evening, while my eye is gratified by a smiling prospect of cultivated fields richly wooded, our own church, and the parsonage house. But oh, how imperfect is my pleasure! I am alone. Why are not you seated with me? And my dear William, why is not he here also? I could almost fancy that I see you both near me. I have chosen a bank where I have room to spare for a resting place for each of you. I hear you point out a spot where, if we could erect a little cottage and call it our own, we shall be the happiest of human beings. I see my brother fired with the idea of leading his sister to such a retreat. And I love this passage. I feel like the way that Dorothy describes the scene, the way that she talks about her wish to be close with her brother and her friend, and her visually making space for them in her present moment and imagining a future with them. I just think it's all very indicative of some of the ways that she created intimacy within her relationships.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if I could can I just tease out one sentence that really kind of ratifies that for me, is that, but oh, how imperfect is my pleasure. I am alone. Why are you not seated with me? And my dear William, why is he not here also? And that move to connect the beloved brother with the beloved friend is very, very symptomatic of the nature of Dorothy's affections. It prefigures actually what she will do when Mary Hutchinson enters the Dove Cottage household. And it's also there in all the kind of multiple permutations of bonds that we see within the significant group or the gang or the set, or however you refer to that little group of friends up in the, you know, between Keswick and Grasmere, who met every day or as often as they could, or met by the Rock of Names to talk about everything. That is that sense of wanting not just something exclusive, but something that actually folds in others. So that to go back to the title of my book, All in Each Other, this came out of Coleridge's observation. Coleridge said, "You are all in each other, but I am lonely and want you." A kind of terribly sad statement of exclusion. And it wasn't correct, because the nature of the household at Dove Cottage was always one where permutations of friendship were happening. And it came out of Coleridge's his unhappiness and his increasingly, desperate state, which got ramped up during 1802.
I loved reading about those themes and how you explored them and unpacked them in your book, All in Each Other. And I just wanted to say the impact of reading it on me. I felt like it made Dorothy more real to me, and it gave me a deeper sense of her as a person, as a creative, and as a friend. which is super interesting to me. And I felt that reading it really made tangible for me, maybe for the first time in a real way. I was on site leading up to the exhibition and visiting Grasmere and getting to go and walk where Dorothy walked and stand where she stood and be there. But almost reading your book, even though I'm now away from that, really made it register for me. Like, wow, like I'm sharing these experiences with Dorothy 200 years,
Yeah.
like
Can I interrupt you to ask you, would you read the poem you sent me this morning? Because you just talked about being where Dorothy was, and I think it might be an appropriate moment to hear that.
Thank you. I wrote this when I was sitting, this little poem fragment in my journal that I brought with me when I went to England. I was sitting in the garden. There's a new they refer to this like little bench that was up in their garden behind Dove Cottage as the Moss Hut, and there was recently a creative project to create a sort of new moss hut that's also in the garden. So I was sitting in there in the garden behind Dove Cottage, and I wrote, "Can we be in dialogue without directly speaking, without meeting? In this moss hut, you are here, now here am I. Your words reach me in my present, and so I reply, same place, different times."
Mm. Mm. It's very touching. And yeah, one of the things that came across to me reading the pamphlet was that you're thinking very innovatively about how we do make those connections and across the centuries. And I wonder if I could just suggest that in response to your wonderful pamphlet, that we might imagine how the group, William, Dorothy, and Coleridge, would be on Facebook. I mean, William obviously wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. Coleridge would be in there all the time, oversharing, long disquisitions about Kant, endlessly into the night. What would Dorothy do? I think she'd post photos primarily, and she'd be very interested in keeping her friends in touch with family news, because her obligation was always one of having to keep the family as united as possible, because she was an orphan, and that orphan consciousness, I think, is central to both her and William. So there she'd be going around she'd write one very beautifully written piece each day. It would be observations taken on a walk accompanied by a photo, or several photos. And then she'd go around her friends to make sure how they are. And she'd be using all the emoji, however you pronounce that word, as much as possible, the cuddly face, the smiley face, whatever. She'd be a supporter, she'd be an enabler. So I think that's how I'd characterize Dorothy as a friend. And that's a kind, in response to what you've done, that's a kind of contemporary way of thinking about it.
I love that. I feel like it gives us such a tangible, visual thing to call up, especially as many of us are on social media nowadays. I think touching on what you were just talking about, sharing memories and connecting through that with maybe people who are further away, or I wanted you to speak about memory. You write very intriguingly about this in your book, All in Each Other, about how Dorothy employs memory in her close relationships, particularly with her brother William, and how whether that's reminiscing on shared memories, or whether that's sharing memories of experiences apart to kind of bridge that closeness.
Yeah, I mean, what that comes out of is the experience of being separated very, very young after the death of the mother and living apart. And what these two did was to try to build up a repository of shared memories by walking, by looking, by writing, by discuss, a kind of a dialogue, a creative process in which memory was constantly present, because they were constantly thinking back to what they had lost. So there's always a sense of kind of loss haunting this, and that is kind of a structure that I think is very important to both their thinking, the idea of making something that will later be looked back on, and that's the structure of Tinton Abbey, isn't it? So it seems to be a pattern that they both share. And the other thing I'd say there is that, of course, memory and imagination are closely connected. Can we ever remember anything without in some way shaping it? So that word Coleridge has, esemplastic, meaning shaping. I think the esemplastic process of the imagination is present in remembering.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think she definitely talks a lot about in some of her letters about how she's imagining friends with her, or imagining future moments with their friends. And I think you write in your book as well about how this imagination and memory really feed into their creative practice as well. There's sometimes, and I know that we're gonna get to that a little bit more in the second half, but I wanted to just use that to kind of set up my next question that I have for you. There's sometimes a perception that Dorothy's dedication to her brother and his writing meant the sacrifice of her own writing, or the exploitation of her efforts. But you write about in All in Each Other about this like gift economy in the Wordsworth household, and about how important reciprocity is in her close relationships. And I wonder if you might talk about that with us.
Sure, that's kind of one of the central themes of the book, and each chapter is really structured around a moment of giving, a significant moment of gift exchange. I want to hold up at this moment this book by Lewis Hyde, The Gift, which is kind of my Bible. I think it's one of the greatest works about creativity and creative process that I've ever read, and it held the writing of All in Each Other together. Jeff wanted me to read so that you could hear a bit of my prose rather than just the poems. He wanted me to read a bit from All in Each Other, and actually, so I chose the bit which defines what I mean by gift exchange. If I can just do that. Marcel Mauss has established that in all societies, advanced as well as primitive, gifts come with a burden attached. The receiver is obliged to reciprocate, first with expressions of gratitude, then with further gifts. In this way, the circulation of gifts through exchange produces an abundance of riches. Unlike commerce in a capitalist economy, however, the increase of riches produced in a gift economy is communal. This is especially the case in respect of creative talent. Lewis Hyde, whose classic study, The Gift, considered how the creative spirit transforms the world, argued that gifts of this kind nourish parts of our spirit that derive from nature, the group, the race, or the gods. To speak of an increase of gifts in this context is to speak of something simultaneously material, social, and spiritual. And then there's a quotation, when the gift has been fed with labor and a spirit of generosity, it grows and it in turn feeds the giver. The gift and its bearers share a spirit which is kept alive by its motion among them, and which in turn keeps them both alive. And that's kind of what I think is the essence of what's going on in the Dove Cottage household, and in the wider group outside the Dove Cottage household, which was really a part of it.
I love that. I was thinking of other places in which gifts come into play, because I'm more familiar with some her friends that she's writing letters to, and that there's one letter that's in the case, and Jeff maybe has it, and that she writes to Jane around Christmas, and she's speaking about how Jane gave her a handkerchief, and she cherishes that, and how she's sending Jane a thimble, and she says, whenever you put it on, I hope it serves to remind you of my affection for you. And I just thought that was beautifully intimate.
Do you think that, is there a sense in which a moment like that is tinged with romantic feelings? There are other things other examples in her exchanges, both with William and with her female friends, where one gets a kind of tinge of it. I'm not wanting to press you towards labeling her at all, because that's not the point. But I just wonder how you respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important question. I agree that throughout this journey, it definitely hasn't been that intent to, like, in any way prove anything about Dorothy in retrospect. But I think the question you're asking here, and what you were speaking about at the beginning, when you were reading the passage about the wedding, I guess my answer to this is kind of twofold. One is like looking at the ways in which the experiences of Aro Ace individuals find resonance in these moments of Dorothy's writings. And then the second is sort of on is about intimacy itself, and like how we maybe categorize that or put meaning to it. So I guess I'll start with the first thing. In reading the passage in the Grasmere Journal, and then also 5 days, oh my gosh, 5 days prior to the wedding, she's writing Jane, and I have that here. She writes, I have long loved Mary Hutchinson as a sister, and she's equally attached to me. This being so, you will guess that I look forward with perfect happiness to this connection between us. But happy as I am, I half dread that concentration of all tender feelings, past, present, and future, which will come upon me on the wedding morning. And I really keyed into the word dread that she uses there, and as well as her sort of emotional overwhelm that she experiences on the day of the wedding. And I thought about in Aro Ace romantic communities, there's a lot of discussion around, there's this particular dread that close relationships will be lost when those individuals get into romantic relationships or get married, and it's its own kind of heartbreak and grief, and I've experienced it before, and many of the group members were sharing their experiences of this. And so when I came across these passages, that's actually immediately what I thought of. Like, I felt very seen in it. And others spoke of that too. Yeah, so I guess that's what I want to say about my first point. And then the second, about intimacy itself, and how we kind of think about that. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. I think when we talk about intimacy, and in this case, I'm using the word intimacy to mean closeness, vulnerability, significance between people. And I think, firstly, that intimacy exists within all types of relationships, whether that's familial, platonic, romantic, sexual. And secondly, I think intimacy is highly contextual. And what I mean by this is that every person is unique. And so therefore, every relationship that exists is unique. And the things that, the methods of meaning making or establishing closeness within that particular relationship is unique to that relationship. And so I think that the way that being open to that possibility means that the way that we like distinguish between different types of relationships is not as easily distinct as we might assume. I think there's a sort of fluidity, or messiness, a very human.
Absolutely.
And I'm really fascinated by the possibilities in applying behaviors or things that we might think of as stereotypically romantic within friendships, as an act of intimacy within a friendship. And I love that Dorothy does that, or I see that in looking at her and her writing, in giving these gifts to Jane, as you were talking about, or in addressing her relationships with the people in those relationships, which maybe we would stereotypically think of, from where we are now, as a very romantic things.
I think everything you're saying there is just immensely persuasive, and I particularly love what you said about the earlier part of the journal and the way that links forward into the wedding day. And I think you've actually brought us back full circle in a very beautiful way, and it might be a point at which Jeff would like to stop. Is that right, Jeff?
I think it is a very appropriate moment to stop. If we have just a couple of moments, and then when we come back, we'll look at the other manuscript. But one thing that just struck me, as you were both talking about the 1793 letter, the one that we were looking at earlier, and compared to this one, say, where there is a bit of spacing between the lines. And in that earlier one, and I think, Samantha, you said there were several sittings, that, you know, we often cram lines together, don't we, when we start and when we finish a letter. But that was crammed lines together from the very beginning, knowing that there were 4 huge pages yet to come. So clearly, she wasn't worried how she was going to fill a page. She had more than enough to say and wanted to make sure, you know, it was all going to go in. So
they're so long, those letters. They are immensely long.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we thought we might introduce really here is this concept and the challenge that we kind of set Lucy to condense a lifetime scholarship into a showcase where you were allowed, I think, 100 words to introduce a story.
Don't remind me.
And then 50 words on each object, probably about each one you could have written a book. And the topic, of course, is the writing of the I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And the significance of this moment is, as we'll see in a moment, that for the first time ever, this manuscript, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, the only pre-publication surviving manuscript of the poem, is in Grasmere. So if you come to the Wordsworth Grasmere between now and just about the end of May, you will see this remarkable manuscript. So what we would like to do is kind of, it's almost like what Lucy wrote, and then we'll hear what she was really thinking, but had to condense down into, I mean, it's almost kind of like your sonnet challenge, isn't it? How do you condense?
I may do it, yeah, yes, actually, yes.
We could have asked you to write a sonnet, but you might have preferred that. So if we start with the introductory label, so I'll turn on the camera, and what we thought we might do is if I read out the label, and then Lucy, you kind of comment if you wish. So to introduce the whole story of how did I wander lonely as a cloud come into being, we had about 100 words, and as you can see, a stunning belt of wild daffodils by the shores of Ullswater caught the attention of William and Dorothy Wordsworth as they walked homeward on a wet and blustery day in April of 1802. Capturing this moment in her journal, Dorothy describes how the daffodils tossed and reeled and danced in the wind. Her words provide a record of shared pleasure in the beauty and energy of the natural world. 2 years later, when William wrote a lyric poem describing a host of golden daffodils, he perhaps recalled that walk and Dorothy's prose. His poem suggests a solitary encounter and visionary joy.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, on that day, William had just finalised his engagement to get married to Mary Hutchinson. And William and Dorothy were walking back to Grasmere together. What were they thinking? Were they talking about the engagement? What was going on in their shared world? What was going on in their separate worlds? I explored that in 2 sonnets, which actually open Vital Stream, and it may be that we'll have time later to look at it, but I want to push on through the manuscripts because that's more important. There's the other question, what's the relationship between the 1802 journal entry and the poem written 2 years later? Did William simply steal Dorothy's moment of epiphany and turn it into a poem of his own? What differences do we notice between the prose and the poem, and what do they tell us about William's and Dorothy's responses to the natural world and to the craft of writing? And actually, I want to hear what Samantha's got to say about that, but I think I'm going to just first of all read the journal entry. Is that, Jeff? Shall I do that?
Yeah, or I can read the label first.
You read the journal entry.
I'll read the label, you read the journal entry. So this is how Lucy summed this up. Dorothy used her Grasmere journal for observations, sometimes personal, sometimes intimately shared. Here the pronoun we is pronounced. Her sentences have a meticulous eye on the object immediacy, but they are carefully crafted, building details gradually and culminating in an evocation of spontaneous, unlimited delight.
Thank you. So here's the passage. When we were in the woods beyond Gowbarrow Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seed ashore and that the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and more, and at last under the boughs of the trees, we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever dancing, ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little knot and a few stragglers a few yards higher up, but they were so few as not to disturb the simplicity and unity and life of that one busy highway. So the commentary that Jeff read out was just so pared down, And what I would have loved to have time to talk about was Dorothy's intense aliveness to the natural world, and especially to the windy weather. It's that is quite a stormy day they're going through there. And was that all strictly true to the fact, or did she make it more turbulent than it actually was because she was in a state of turbulence herself about the engagement? We don't know. The other thing is her choice of register. The very homely word belt, the familiarity of that phrase about the breadth of a country turnpike road, and the nice detail, a little knot. And then occasionally we get a lift of register, as when she uses the word verily. Or then the moment when she kind of turns definitely for a moment into a poet. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness. And hear the beat of that. That's a poet writing, isn't it? So the shift into a poetic register, I think, is very interesting. But I want to hear what Samantha's got to say.
I think I really loved reading, hearing what you just said, but also reading in your book about your literary analysis of Dorothy's writings, because I think it's not just that, Dorothy wrote these journals and so she's a writer and so they're valuable for what they say and what they describe, and that we should read them because of that, which is true. But I think it was really amazing to see how you looked at her experimentation and her sense of finding her voice or a style, like testing out different things. Clearly a love of language and of rhythm and different things that are coming through that just demonstrate that she is a writer and that she has this this intent or thinking of herself as a writer, even if not like fully consciously all the time.
No, I absolutely agree with you, Samantha. I think that's a tremendously important point, and at this moment I will hold up a visual aid. This is a book we should not forget, Dorothy Wordsworth, Writer, by Pamela Wolf. One of the very, very best pieces of writing on this subject, probably the best. And what Pamela does is just that, shows us the craftsmanship. And what she's got, Pamela, is because she's got the ability to read the manuscript so accurately, she can show us the ways in which moments of writing are revised. So we get that sense constantly of creative process, of the materiality of the moment. What I think is how I'd describe it. Shall we move on to the next bit, or do you want to say something, Jeff?
I was simply going to say that you mentioned about the sort of the turbulent weather, and the letter that Dorothy wrote. I think the 16th of April, just after this, describing the walk in a letter form, makes it plain that it really was a windy day. I mean, wasn't it? It was really wet. It was really windy. And I guess in greater contrast, as it were, when we come to the poem.
Exactly.
The breeze.
Exactly.
That's very different, wasn't it?
That's just such a big difference, isn't it? It's amazing.
It's a very big difference.
Are you going to do?
Poem. So this is the manuscript, and I'm sorry it's so dark, and I'm sorry that my shadow's in the way, but we're so strictly limited in the light levels. When we install a manuscript like this, we have a courier from the British Library who comes, and we have to prove that we can keep this at below 50 lux, which is quite low, and so I'm afraid it isn't very easy to see in this context. But it starts off, it's in Mary Wordsworth's hand, and it starts off with an instruction to the printer. So this is the manuscript, one of the group of papers that William, Dorothy, Mary, Sarah Hutchinson put together while they were at Culloden over the winter of 1806 to 7, that led to the poems in 2 volumes, the 1807 poems. So it's a mixture of instructions, as you can see, like this, telling the printer where to put the poem and things like that, and then the poem itself. And there it is. And we've had a lot of visitors come to see it, and a colleague was telling me that many visitors were surprised how small it was. But then that's what manuscripts are. They're not always big and dramatic, but it is what it is. So this is what Lucy wrote about it. The manuscript of I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud consists of 3 6-line stanzas with only 1 correction. So we can see the correction at the top line there. An additional verse between the first and second stanzas was added later and can be seen in published versions of the poem from 1850 onwards. While William's description of the scene bears similarities with Dorothy's journal entry, his writing emphasises the transcendent power of the human imagination.
That's great. And Jeff, I think because this is William writing, we should hear your voice here reading it. I do think we need to hear the poem, even though probably everybody knows it quite well. Can we have that?
We can do. This is, I have to say to everybody watching, this is totally unrehearsed and unprepared.
I'm sorry. Do you want me to do it? I can do it.
I think you should do it. I think we should hear your voice.
Okay. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of dancing daffodils. Along the lake, beneath the trees, 10,000 dancing in the breeze. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a laughing company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So there are so many, how are we going to go about this? Because there are so many things we could observe here. Well, first off, it's a poem. It's a lyric poem. Therefore, it's very distinct from a piece of prose. So the people who just say, well, he took Dorothy's journal entry and just stole it and turned it into a poem aren't really, they're just blaming him for his choice of genre and of medium. It seems a very curious accusation, and we've seen it so many times that there's an act of plagiarism here. So what are the differences? I mean, first off, there's the emphasis on solitary wandering. This is a poem very much about joy, but it's not about shared joy, as Dorothy's journal entry clearly is, because the emphasis there is on the plural pronoun. The other thing, one of the other things we could notice is that the way though the images of crowd and host give a sense of magnitude to the vision. And is host there a synonym for crowd, or is it suggesting something more heavenly? It's curious the way the idea of the urban comes in with crowd, I think. 10,000 saw I at a glance. Well, she didn't count the journals. She didn't count the daffodils for him. This, I think, is the biggest number he could think of. It's just a moment of thinking in terms of massiveness. And then, as you were saying earlier, Jeff, the breeze rather than the wind. There's no sense here of agitation or turmoil within the subject, within the writing subject. There's just that sense of an encounter, an epiphany, a moment of recognition of nature's extraordinary beauty. And then perhaps the most important thing of all, the way in which in this poem he's talking about how he remembers with the inward eye. He remembers with the inward eye. So it's again that structure of memory that we were talking about, the importance of memory, the inward eye being very much so here the shaping power of memory. So very different from Dorothy in that respect. Any thoughts from you two?
I think when we put the panel together that goes above the showcase, and we wanted to put William and Dorothy's writings together, maybe I'll just, it's a little brighter, if I just shine above there, if you can read that. And so,
Yeah.
You know, the daffodils tossed, I'm sorry, my hands are shaking, they reeled and danced, and seemed as if they were with the wind, the waves beside them danced. And I read this out to someone without saying that these were two, as it were, two different pieces of writing. And the person I read it out to, obviously, well, they thought it was the same piece, as it were, you know, and I know one's verse, one's prose, but the language and the experience, as it were, it's very
but that I noticed when you sent me the material with your tyrannical words about how little I had to write. I noticed that you sent me that, and I thought, oh, that's cunning, because he's picked out the place of most convergence with that emphasis on laughter and dancing. That you know, that is where they're coming together, isn't it? In that idea of joy, and perhaps that's reflecting. Is it some kind of memory of that day by Ullswater? You know, I mean, we don't know, do we, what happened here? I hypothesize. This is my hypothesis, that in 1804 or 1805. We're not quite sure when it was written. William was out on a walk somewhere around Grasmere, perhaps, or either on his own or with Dorothy, and saw some daffodils. And that he remembered the day when he was walking back with her just after he'd got engaged to Mary Hutchinson, a very memorable day. And he said to her, why don't we look at the journal and remember what we were doing and how we were feeling? And so they got the journal out, looked at it, and out of that looking and out of the conversation came his poem, which is a very different process from the one where we imagine him sitting, going through Dorothy's journal, hunting for bits he can steal, which is kind of what, you know, what has been argued in many cases about his relationship with Dorothy's writing.
It is, I think, the next day when they're at the bridge at Brotherswater, and Dorothy sort of leaves William to write a poem, doesn't she? And when he comes back, he's written this poem. So the poem, as it were, comes first. Then Dorothy describes the scene in her journal. And again, it's similar to this, where the vocabulary and the observations have strong similarities. So that's maybe that example where the poem comes before the journal.
Absolutely. It's very important to remember it goes that way as well. Yeah.
So if we move on to the last exhibit, the last object, there we have the poems. When I say about the light levels, it's in no way a complaint, because it's what we have to do. We have to preserve these things for generations to come. But I'm sorry, it does just make it so difficult to get enough light to focus and to see it. But it's absolutely for the right reasons. This is what Lucy wrote about this book. Poems in 2 volumes is a collection of lyric poems, mostly composed between 1802 and 1805 in and around Dove Cottage. They're grouped under different headings. I wandered lonely as a cloud, appearing in a section titled Moods of My Own Mind.
Yeah.
You even used all your 50 words there, Lucy, I think.
Oh dear, that was hell. That was hell, because I wanted, of course, to write about what that volume, or sorry, the two volumes of 1807 meant. And there's so much one could say about them pulling together the vision of Grasmere that had been collaboratively created by the siblings. And the ordering of the volume and all sorts of intricate things I wanted to say, but instead I just had to write a few sentences. So what I think I'd want to pick up now is that the poems were submitted to the printer in batches, and at the top of the page, Wordsworth wrote a note to the printer about the placement of this particular poem. And he asked the printer to include it straight after The Cock is Crowing, which is actually the moment that Jeff has just alluded to, where the two siblings stand and observe a scene, and then we get a poem and a journal entry. So he's wanting it to be next to the poem that was written on that memorable day by Ullswater, which Dorothy captured in her journal. So how can we read the significance of that placement then? Is it his recognition that the daffodils he saw and wrote about in his poem were indeed the very daffodils that appear in Dorothy's journal? Could we read it that way? Could we also read it as a kind of tacit inclusion of Dorothy within the poem, even though she's not mentioned? Those are possibilities. Interestingly, when the poem was published again in 1815, it moved from being, the title moved from being poems of moods of my mind to being poems of the imagination, which is a very significant shift, isn't it, if we think about the difference between mood and imagination. So he's actually recognizing it in a different way. He's seeing the shaping power of the memory, and all those things that are connected with a higher level of discourse than just moods of my mind. And the other thing is that he added another verse in 1815, which he inserted between the first and second stanzas of the 1807 poem. And here's the verse. Probably most people will know this because, I mean, don't we know this version from our childhood? Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. So what he's done is he's moved 10,000 down to a lower position in the poem, and he's replaced 10,000 in its original position with fluttering and dancing. So I think a thing to notice there is the way that the visionary dimension of the poem is enhanced by including the galaxy. This is no longer a poem where we're on the ground all the way through. We've suddenly got the connection with the galaxy and the spiritual connotations of the heavens through the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way.
I think just thinking too about the shared involvement. We were discussing, weren't we, the other day, that William attributes what he calls two of the best lines, doesn't he, to Mary, who
yes, thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. The recognition in the notes dictated to Isabella Fenwick late in life, that recognition that the best lines came from Mary, which is so important, isn't it, in reminding us of her inclusion in possible dialogues around poems. And what do we do? Can we think about them as kind of having conversations in which each of them, you know, Dorothy and Mary, interject with suggestions. It's a very different process from the old model of thinking that he just, you know, ripped off Dorothy's writing.
I think if we imagine, given that Mary and Dorothy were so heavily involved in the transcription,
yeah, exactly, yeah,
you know, that sitting around that table in Dove Cottage, we just can't imagine, can we, that Mary and Dorothy sat in silence, just, you know, following words with every instruction. That must have been a conversation.
Absolutely. Jeff, can I, just because it looks as if we've got time, could I at this moment just read the opening poems of Vital Stream, which are where, just to give an example of the way that I'm kind of allowing myself as a poet to do things that I would not have dreamt of doing as a literary biographer. And you'll see the marked difference. So the very first poem in the volume is Dorothy Observes, 15th of April, 1802. And this is written in a Meredith sonnet, a 16-line sonnet. And I found that I wanted to use an informal, a looser and more informal sonnet structure for Dorothy's voice, whereas for William, I tended to use, on the whole, the tighter, more formal Petrarchan structure, or the Shakespearean structure. And in the case of Coleridge, what I do is use a lot of cut-ups. That is, I go to his journals and take segments out of them and turn them, by editing them, turn them into sonnet-like forms. So what we get is a sense of ventriloquized voices throughout the collection. So anyway, back to Dorothy Observes, 15th of April, 1802. It was a threatening, cold, misty day as we set off from Mewsmere, the lake rough, the wind furious, seizing our breath. We saw a plough working, a boat at play, and a thick belt of daffodils stirring like a busy highway along the shore. Then more and more of them, and yet more. Some reeled and danced in the wind's whirring, some rested their heads for weariness. Across the lake and within each stormy bay, the tossing waves sounded like the sea. All was alive in the wind's restlessness as we continued our homeward journey. And throughout this day of celebration, there was universal animation. I, the one thing, anxious, stunned, solitary. And then the immediate poem after that is William Frets. Have I not reason for trepidation on this stormy, wind-thrashed, ominous day, of all things the most vexed and lonely mid nature's general agitation? My birthday past, and with it half my life, I am already husband, father, brother, soon to see my daughter and my lover, forever bonded to my future wife. All is fixed, our wedding date decided. Relieved, of course, by England's peace with France, I am in turmoil, with a troubled sense of loyalties unequally divided. Firm and forthright, my sister strides ahead, her eyes turned from the dark and lowering hills to rest her gaze on the dancing daffodils, the golden dancing daffodils instead.
And I'm very pleased to say that visitors to the museum, as well as the 3 exhibits that we've seen, will also see Lucy's poem. So we may have restricted you to 50 words for the object, Lucy, but it's wonderful to have your poems in the show.
And Jeff, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for, hugely for the support that you give to contemporary poets, year in, year out, and that you have given to me in this particular case. Thank you for them from the bottom of my heart.
But you're very, very welcome. It just makes a perfect showcase to interpret poetry through poetry. is a very perfect place to be. And your book that tells, if you like, how poetry works through poems is also a great thing. Samantha, just before we finish, is there any, you don't have to, but if there's any thoughts you would like to just share, and then we'll perhaps come to a close.
I really liked, I think that it's interesting, the talking about how conversation and this creative collaborative process, but I also feel like it's interesting to think about this shared, so there's the shared creative process happening, but also the shared like inspiration moment. And that feels like crucial too, like another aspect of intimacy coming into play, like having these moments together, and then referring back to them, you know, going back to the memory bit, or where she talks about imagining her friends, like thinking back on these moments, and wanting to write about them, wanting to produce something creative from them. That feels very, very, very special.
Well, she's shaping gifts, isn't she?
Yeah.
Well, we must, I think, draw just to a close now. Just to say, really, if you want to see what events are coming up, subscribe to our social media or subscribe to our Eventbrite page, just to whet your appetites. This is a list worth listening to. We've got our next event is Michelle Levy, Simon Fraser University, who's going to talk us through a manuscript, Dorothy Wordsworth's Commonplace Book. We're going to go through it page by page, exploring it together. In April and May, we've got two events that look at 18th century, 19th century medicine and disability in the lives of women writers. And one of the events will focus particularly on the Cumbrian poet Susanna Blaemire. So that's coming up. Jessica Fay of Birmingham University is going to look at Dorothy Wordsworth and painters. I mean, that's a whole new subject to me, certainly, and how her writing compares with the painting that was going on at the time and the painters themselves. Coming up, we've got an event on ridiculous romantics, which is part of a project with a school in Lancashire and Edge Hill University that looks at some of the absurdities in Romanticism. Then we've got an event coming up on William and Dorothy Wordsworth's garden, the history of the cottage garden, the makeup of the garden, around about 1800. And then one of the projects we're working at the moment is the rewriting of lyrical ballads. And it's being rewritten by people who are homeless in Manchester and Kendal. And that'll be coming up in September. So there's a real variety of things past and present. I'd like to once again thank Hannah, because Hannah is involved in the preparation, the marketing, the social media, the technology, and the welcome. So without Hannah, I don't exaggerate, we wouldn't be doing this. The past webinars are on YouTube. If it wasn't for you attending, this would be pointless altogether too. So thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. It gives us a real buzz, as I say. Come and see the manuscript. It's on display here. But then just to end with the final word of thanks to Samantha and Lucy. You won't mind me saying, will you, Samantha, that you're a bit nervous about tonight? Well, I have to say, having watched it, you would never know. That was a natural performance as anyone could wish for. You put us all at ease. So thank you. I think you said it, Lucy, when you said that Samantha's arguments were persuasive. It's a kind of, you know, it's a new way of thinking, and we've explored that really quite a lot tonight. And in terms of the poem, the daffodils and the journal, nobody better to talk us through it, Lucy. And that was just a real treat to listen to that. I think I'll just sort of, perhaps a final thought on this is that we tend to perhaps get over familiar with the daffodils, as we call it, or I Wandered Lonely. And it's just worth, I think, if you haven't seen it, in the gallery upstairs, we've got a video, and it features a man who lived with dementia, and he valued that poem so much. And one of our most moving moments in the Jerwood Centre, the library next door, was when he read that poem from a first edition. It meant so much to him. And interestingly, he knew the 4-stanza version and he tripped over the words that had changed between the two. And his wife, after his death, his wife did a video for us telling us what the poem meant. And it may be familiar, but for this man, John, at the point of his life when he couldn't communicate, when the poem was read to him, he couldn't communicate verbally, but when the poem was read to him, there were signs clearly that it was resonating with him, even when his other communication faculties weren't available. So it's a poem that deeply matters, as we know. And thank you, Lucy, for talking us through and bringing it alive. So a final word of thanks to you both, and a thank you again to everyone who's joined us. And I hope we see you. I hope we see you in about a month's time. So I shall say good night. Good night.